In the late 70s, I went to a wild and free architecture school called SCI-arc, the Southern California Institute of Architecture. And even though it was very open and creative, we did study classic methods of understanding visual information and all sorts of images.
The basics of these five principles is pretty easy to grasp, but to develop them in nuance to make a powerful artwork can take a long time. Perhaps you've seen paintings like this from artist P.A. Mondrian. He had an earlier style that was more typically illustrative, but he developed this minimalist, refined system. And it may look simple, but he spent years figuring out how to work within this system he created for himself. The paintings are actually oil paint, and though these look perfectly straight, they are painted with a brush with no mechanical layout. So, if you've read the handout, you're familiar with these five principles. And the real art of composition is to have a system. And by the way, there are many, many compositional systems. We're just choosing a classic one. But the art of it is to combine more than one principle in an artwork. For me, this first principle is really clear and very simple. As he says, the initial thing is a power of composition with a vertical meeting a horizontal. But I also like to think from that about how could I make possibly opposition with a single line. And one thing that comes to mind is maybe I could make opposition like this, where it rolls in upon itself. Another idea about composition is you have to be really responsible for the format you're working with. In this case, let's say it's the white background of this slide. And so I could say opposition could be created by drawing a line that is in reference to this perceived line of the edge of the paper.
So on a piece of unruled paper, I'll just draw over this slide. You can just make some boxes. It helps if they're a little more rectilinear than the ones I'm drawing. And the proportion is critical. So the relationship of horizontal to vertical is significant, but you can just make 6 boxes and then just try different ideas of composition. There's no exact right, wrong answer. And as I said, opposition, I think, is a pretty easy, it's very powerful. Also, maybe you can think of an example in a building that shows opposition.
Dow says that transition is about softening the harsh composition of oppositional lines. Advance to the next slide and doodle your own example of, and it's just a sort of experiment. What other arrangement of lines might create a sense of transition?
I admit I tend to get a little hung up on this bracket idea from Dow's work, and I'm drawing with a mouse. Sorry, kind of ugly. But what else is transition? I think a fairly straight line transitioning to a wilder one. That's an element of this principle. And below, on this bottom of the slide, a circle on the left, a square on the right. What are the stages that goes through to metamorphosize from one form to another? That's another type of transition.
When I think about subordination, I think about visual dynamics, but I also think about the way that people subordinate one another sometimes. For example, if you ever go on an interview and you're seeing the owner or one of the key managers in a company, they will probably have an impressive office, or often they do. And subordination could take place where they're sitting behind a giant desk in a big high back chair, and you're invited to come into the office and sit in a little chair across from them. It sort of establishes a power imbalance. The same thing would be teaching, standing behind a lectern with everyone sitting, which is one reason I don't like to stand behind a lectern. So, a visual example of subordination. Advance to the next slide. I'll give you a couple of my ideas and then doodle one of your own. So, in architecture, you often want a degree of primacy versus secondary. You generally want to make it very clear where the front door of the house is, and that it's not this one, it's this one. And here are a few other examples. I like the example of subordination in a sense that the branches of a tree are subordinate to the trunk. And if there were little leaflets or branchlets, those would be subordinate to this. So I think these are good examples. So this is kind of a silly example from quite a while ago. I used to like robot dancing, and these were the world champion robot dancers probably 10 years ago. And one thing about Nick and Jeppy is that one of them was very tall and one was very short, and they used that in the composition of their dance moves. Other ideas I have about subordination would be, I think we could say that this line at the top of the page very likely subordinates one at the bottom. I think we could also say that a big bold line tends to subordinate a thin one. So doodle a couple of your own examples, or at least one example of what in visual terms might create a sense of subordination.
There's a lot of architecture that subordinates people, corporate towers that are meant to show how successful and powerful we are. And there are also forms of architecture that express egalitarian beliefs. The example of real dominating architecture that comes to mind is Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, and that was completely about demonstrating we're right because we're so big and powerful.
If you happen to be wearing clothing, socks, or a shirt that has any pattern on it, that's an example of repetition. And the reason why so much of our clothing has pattern is because it has a power and sort of a pleasing harmony. So all it takes is two things to create repetition. And if you think about the work of Andy Goldsworthy, always there is repetition. He's using all these principles, but always he has repetition. Repetition is a key part of expressing power as a nation. So the United States might arrive in a small country with four battleships or a couple aircraft carriers. There's multiple reasons why armies have identical uniforms, but one function of it is to create solidarity. Another function is to express the power of we have these unique uniforms. And third reason is to not, of course, get shot by the wrong person. The repetition element is constantly on display if you've ever seen a military parade. And now you can just doodle some motif across the slide. And again, anything at all can be repeated. I'm not able to draw that clearly with a mouse, but I think you get the idea. It's a simple process, but a very powerful one. Of course, we see symmetry constantly in nature, whether it's flower petals, there are all sorts of symmetries. There are bilateral symmetries. There are the sort of butterfly symmetries, wing symmetries. Birds don't fly too well if their wings aren't symmetrical. And it turns out that one of the differentiations of, say, someone who's a model or a supermodel is it tends to be that their face is absolutely symmetrical, whereas with most of us, there's a not that immediately perceivable asymmetry. So the human face is actually the thing that we see the most clearly, and that's because it's important for survival. And we expect the features on a face to be at least fairly symmetrical, or we're disturbed. If someone doesn't have perfect teeth, dentists will fix that, and they will definitely fix it where the teeth have a fairly idealized symmetry. So just draw an example of symmetry of anything that comes to mind.
I always think of the image from the first Star Wars film, the cantina full of all the aliens. While it's true that many of them have symmetry, they're tending more towards monstrous, and here's a creature with one eye. And just, I'd say maybe the scariest mass are things that are very asymmetrical or just very not human. So again, that's just the example of we look for certain things in a human face, and I bet that when this scene was developed, that the artists and art director, I bet they did doodles saying, "What if we have seven eyes on a creature whose face is like just the big trunk of an elephant?" And you start to get through this game where you're getting to possibilities that are a bit shocking.
The beauty of the Eiffel Tower is partly its bilateral symmetry and partly its triangulation, which I can't really draw very well. Triangulation is a core structural principle in architecture, and without it, the Eiffel Tower would have immediately collapsed upon itself. And I also might mention that this arc piece, and if you've been to the Eiffel Tower, you probably noticed that that has zero structural benefit. It was added because this was such a radical structure in the year it was built. It was trying to mimic a Roman arch to give people a little bit of something to relate to. An important thing to remember is that the artists of the Renaissance were obsessed with symmetry, and a master like Da Vinci, part of so much of his genius was studying the symmetry of pieces that he was painting, human figures, and thinking about, in this case, this is a golden section. It's an idealized rectangular proportional system, which creates this spiral. Uh, you could write a book about a single Da Vinci painting. So just keep in mind that the really high quality art is blending multiple structural principles in a single work.
So contemplate this ephemeral art object made by Andy Goldsworthy. He typically takes hours and hours. He's incredibly patient. And these are leaves he found out in a forest, and they're chromatically separated. So the time is what leads to what If you didn't know this was leaves, it would be a surprise to stumble upon this in a forest, but you know this wasn't made in 20 minutes. Working for hours and hours on an artwork does not guarantee quality, but in this case, you cannot rush this. I'm not even sure what these lines are. They look like tubing. Maybe they're stripped center stems of leaves. Again, his aesthetic, he just evolves and evolves. And the piece is made. He did take photos of it, and then it blows away, drifts away, decays. It's just part of his process. So again, anything we look at has compositional order, and Arthur Wesley Dow's system is just one way to start to contemplate the complexity of things. It's the same artist, Andy Goldsworthy, with a completely different aesthetic. There's a jaggedness to this composition, and then interesting, this beautiful piece. He made it out in nature. He found the feathers of a blue heron, and then he doesn't take tools with him, so he used a rock to split the shaft of the feather in half. And then in his head, he has this lightning bolt type image, and he places it on moist, dark soil. And maybe he does take a photograph, obviously, but then he walks away from it and it blows off. And no one, if you didn't stumble upon it, you'd never know it was there. So I hope you found these slides about this classic compositional system valuable. Uh, it's easy to hold these five principles in your head. And I know that my teachers would often say, why did you just do one thing? Why is this building or this painting or this collage of a face, why is it only this one idea of symmetry? So just take these principles with you, look at environment, look at art, look at buildings, and see that there's this order in everything.